These plays were broken down into three categories: mystery plays that dealt with the life of Christ, miracle plays that dealt with the life of saints, and morality plays, which were allegories that dealt with the way common man struggles for salvation. Morality plays praised the seven virtues: prudence, justice, temperance, fortitude, faith, hope, and charity, and condemned the seven deadly sins: pride, lust, anger, covetousness, gluttony, envy, and sloth. Morality plays eventually developed into secular or folk plays dealing with folk heroes like Robin Hood, but they still tended to be teaching good morals as stated by the Christian Bible. So, in another odd twist of fate, the church, which had virtually succeeded in killing theater, ended up resurrecting it. That certainly wasn't their intent, but that's what happened. For this class, I tried to trace the direct line of theater from what we have now back to where it started, which, as I stated earlier, is one of the reasons that I focus on Greek theater and not on the theater that was happening elsewhere in the world. The Renaissance, which came right after the medieval period, which was right after the Dark Ages, started in Europe in some places as early as the 14th century, and other places not until the 16th century. The development of theater in the United States was more heavily influenced by British theater, where the Renaissance came later, than it was by the developments of the early Renaissance in Italy and Spain. One of the chief exceptions is a development in Italian theater known as commedia dell'arte, which can be directly translated to comedy of the profession. The theater troupes that performed commedia dell'arte were some of the first professional actors in Europe. They made a living from acting. The chief thing that Western theater took from commedia dell'arte is the concept of stock characters. Characters that are easily identifiable as a type that has a specific or a set of specific known qualities. Writing stock characters continues to be a part of theater today. There are young lovers, foolish fathers, and inept bosses. There are servants who are smarter than their employer, and educated people who lack all common sense. Stock characters help playwrights tell a story more easily because the audience identifies the type of character and knows what to expect of them. The playwright doesn't have to spend a lot of time developing that character through exposition. The audience simply goes, "Oh, well, that's the little snotty brat character. I understand what to expect from them." Or, "Oh, that's the hero, the good guy. I understand what to expect from them." Italian theater of the Renaissance also gave us the term intermezzi, which were small comedic acts performed between the larger acts of a play. And this is where we get our modern term, intermission. It should also be noted that opera started during the Italian Renaissance. But in most ways, opera has very little to do with the development of theater. It would seem natural that musical theater would have developed from opera, but that isn't the case. That's not to say that opera didn't have some influence on theater and musical theater, but it's not a direct line from opera to them. The way operas were staged and the development of scenery for operas and the machines used to manipulate that scenery do have a major influence on the development of technical theater in England in the late 1600s. But our theater today was more influenced by the English interpretation of the operatic style of staging, not the operatic style of staging directly. Just before the English Renaissance began, the ruler of England was Henry VIII. And he did something that strongly influenced how theater would develop in England. He split from the Catholic Church and started the Church of England. English theater at that time were performing the miracle and mystery plays that were based upon the teachings of the Catholic Church, and this quickly came to an end. And English theater saw a sudden increase in the production of morality and secular styles of theater. Henry VIII theoretically banned all plays about religion and politics, but he recognized the power of theater as propaganda. Playwrights of the time quickly learned that if they produced plays that made the break from the Catholic Church seem like the right thing, that made Catholicism seem like the wrong thing, the government permitted them and even encouraged it. Theater artists were totally dependent upon the support of wealthy people in the government. They had to do the types of plays that were popular with those types of people or suffer the consequences, which could be anything from not making a living to being put to death. Henry VIII died in 1547, and there was a decade following his death where there were 3 different rulers, 2 Protestants and a Catholic, which led to a decade of strife and turmoil. At the end of that decade, Elizabeth I became the ruler. Elizabeth took over a country in turmoil and led it into a golden age. Art, commerce, and conquest flourished. People enjoyed financial stability, safety, and less hunger than they had in previous generations. And so they had the extra time and energy to put into things like the arts and theater. Prior to the Elizabethan era, actors were considered vagrants and vagabonds, traveled about from town to town, and were often arrested. No public theaters were allowed within the city limits of London prior to Elizabeth. But during Elizabeth's reign, acting troupes were licensed and were under the patronage of wealthy nobles, and that gave actors a much higher financial level of stability and social status. There were many playwrights popular during the Elizabethan era, but the one that had the most influence on our theater today was Shakespeare. According to popular legend, Shakespeare was born on April 23rd and died on April 23rd, 1564 and 1616, respectively. Little is known about Shakespeare's upbringing and early life. Lots of people say he didn't have the education that would allow him to be the genius that he was. But that's the interesting thing about geniuses. They often rise out of situations that should never have produced them. It is known or thought that Shakespeare left his family in Stratford and joined an acting company somewhere between 1585 and 1592. There exists a pamphlet from 1592 where a man named Robert Greene called Shakespeare that upstart crow who borrows plots for his own plays. That establishes Shakespeare as having at least written a play or 2 in London by 1592. And as I stated earlier, it establishes Shakespeare as a borrower of plots. Shakespeare is credited with having written at least 37 plays. He wrote comedies, tragedies, and histories. His plays were performed at first at a theater inside the city limits of London, but when they lost the lease on that building, he and his partner, James Burbage, a famous actor and producer of the time, built the Globe Theatre just outside of the city limits, where the rules for theater were less strict. The original Globe Theatre burned to the ground in 1613 during a performance of Henry VIII. It is thought that a cannon used as a sound effect for the show caught the thatch on fire. It was rebuilt almost immediately and remained open until 1644, when it was torn down by the Puritans, who were now in power. Very close to the site of the original Globe is a reproduction that is very much in the style of and looks like the old Globe Theatre. I've been there. It's like stepping back in time. Almost all theaters built during the Elizabethan era were roughly round or circular in shape and open to the sky. Plays were performed only during daylight hours and in the summer months. There was no scenery to speak of. Actors conveyed through dialogue where the play was set, what time the day was, etc. This was a convention that audiences readily accepted. Women were not allowed to perform, so all women's roles were performed by young boys whose voices had yet to deepen. This means that Shakespeare's greatest women's roles were originated by boys. This also accounts for why there are usually no more than 3 female roles in a Shakespearean play. They simply didn't have enough qualified boys to do any more than that.